Late autumn of 1941, Nagasaki. The launch whistle shrieked across Mitsubishi's No. 2 slipway as the newest cargo ship in Japan's merchant marine began her slow, ceremonial slide toward the water. The grey hull, sleek as a sword blade and riveted with almost obsessive precision, glimmered under the pale afternoon sun. Steam curled from nearby hammer forges. Painters scrambled down staging ladders. Senior shipwrights, men whose fathers and grandfathers had shaped steel for the Imperial Navy, stood with arms folded, admiring their craft. She was a beautiful ship, nearly 500 feet from stem to stern, with plate seams so clean they looked drawn with a brush. Her boilers were hand-fitted. Her rivet lines formed perfect arcs. The drafting master, a thin man with spectacles wired together at the bridge, tapped his cigarette and exhaled with quiet pride. "This," he said to the young engineer beside him, "is how a nation builds its strength one flawless ship at a time. The Americans build toys, we build ships." Behind them, the hull groaned softly as she tasted water for the first time. Workers bowed. The band struck up a march. The shipwrights stood taller, convinced that craftsmanship artistry even was the backbone of maritime power. They had no idea they were standing inside the wrong century. Across the Pacific, in a cramped, drafty office in Washington, D.C., two men from the United States Maritime Commission studied a very different drawing. Where Mitsubishi's creation was curved and elegant, the blueprint on their table was blunt, boxy, and almost insultingly plain. The bow was stub-nosed. The stern was squared off. The cargo holds were arranged with the meticulous simplicity of a child's building blocks. "It looks like a brick," one inspector muttered. "That's the point," the naval architect replied. He tapped the stack of papers with a pencil. "A brick is easy to make, over and over, in any yard, with any crew." The Americans were not designing a masterpiece, they were designing a template. The idea had first taken shape more than a year earlier, when British officials, already bleeding tonnage in the Battle of the Atlantic, begged the United States for cargo ships. Not elegant ships, not fast ships, just ships that floated, carried goods, and could be built faster than German submarines could sink them. The British had proposed a simple plan based on a pre-war tramp steamer, but the Americans saw an opening far bigger than Britain imagined. What if a ship could be built like an automobile? What if an unskilled workforce, women from Kansas, farmers from Iowa, machinists who had never touched a keel, could weld prefabricated sections together the way General Motors assembled chassis? What if the ship did not need to be beautiful, or fast, or modern, only reproducible? In late 1941, while Japanese shipwrights in Nagasaki toasted the birth of one exquisitely crafted freighter, a quiet committee in Washington approved a design that looked more like a compromise than a revolution. The EC-2SC-1 cargo ship. In time, the world would know her as the Liberty ship. She was the antithesis of everything Japanese shipbuilding valued. Japan's shipyards, Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, Harima, were monuments to skill. Their craftsmen could hand-fit a rivet within a hair's breadth. They shaped hulls around custom engine rooms. Every ship, whether a merchant vessel or a transport, carried the signature of the artisans who built her. And because Japan believed its war in the Pacific would be short a sprint to seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia before the United States could fully mobilize, this system of bespoke shipbuilding felt sufficient. But the empire's maritime foundation had two fatal weaknesses. First, Japan's merchant fleet, though respected, was fragile. On the eve of war, it hovered around 6 million gross tons, a respectable figure, but thinly stretched across an empire that depended entirely on imported oil, rubber, iron ore, bauxite, rice, and machine parts. Every gallon of fuel that fed a Zero fighter or powered the combined fleet began its journey in a tanker vulnerable to submarine attack. Every army division deployed to Malaya or the Philippines required transport ships Japan struggled to replace. Second, Japan's shipbuilding philosophy, rooted in craftsmanship and pride, was incapable of scaling. A single merchantman might take many months. Skilled riveters and fitters were precious. Welding was still a specialty craft, not a mass production technique. Steel shortages slowed each project, And every hull was, in some small but critical way, unique. Perfection, in war, is expensive. Too expensive. Back in Washington, none of this craft worship mattered. The Maritime Commission's inspectors were not sculptors, they were problem solvers. Their ugly ship, 44 feet of beam, welded seams, simple triple expansion engine was engineered not for elegance, but for multiplication. It could be built in shipyards that did not yet exist, by workers who had never built a ship, using techniques that did not require a master's hand. It was a ship designed to be stamped, not sculpted, and, above all, it was fast. Not in the water she would plod across oceans at 11 knots, but in creation. If the idea worked, hundreds of hulls could be launched each year. Eventually, thousands. Where Japan's shipyards saw a ship as a child to be raised, America's planners saw a ship as a unit to be replicated. Still standing on the dock, the young Japanese engineer bowed as the freshly launched vessel settled into the harbor. He believed, truly, that Japan's future rested in these handcrafted giants. He believed that craftsmanship meant supremacy. He believed that a single perfect ship meant more than a dozen crude ones. He could not know that somewhere in a dusty office in Washington, a naval architect was closing a folder on the new standard ship and saying, "If war comes, we build until the sea is covered." By choosing beauty over reproducibility, Japan had unknowingly stepped into a maritime war built on numbers it could never match. The ship sliding down Mitsubishi's rails that afternoon was, without question, exquisite. She was also, though no one yet understood it, a relic. The war that loomed over the horizon would not be won by the prettiest ship. It would be won by the one that could be built 1,000 times. Winter of 1941, Washington, D.C. Snow clung to the windowsills of the Maritime Commission's headquarters as Rear Admiral Emery Land, calm, bespectacled, methodical, clicked a brass pen against a stack of papers. The war in Europe had turned the Atlantic into a cemetery of steel. British merchant losses were climbing by the week. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could lay keels. Every figure arriving from London was worse than the last. Across the table, a younger analyst cleared his throat. "Sir, at this rate the British merchant fleet collapses within the year." Land did not blink. "Then we will build them a new one." The men around him exchanged glances. With what shipyards? With what workers? The United States had never attempted shipbuilding on such a scale. American shipyards produced fine vessels, liners, tankers, destroyers, but in small numbers and at a leisurely peacetime pace. Nothing in American history suggested the country could flood the oceans with cargo ships the way Germany was flooding the Atlantic with submarines. Yet on the table lay the blueprint of a gamble. A ship so plain it bordered on insulting. A ship no naval architect would brag about. A ship deliberately designed to be good enough. The EC-2, SC-1, the Liberty ship. It was the product of a cultural pivot that few noticed at the time. The rejection of naval artistry in favor of industrial logic. The blueprint did not care about elegance. It cared about parts that could be manufactured inland, shipped by rail, and welded together by men and women who had never worked near the sea. "Gentlemen," Land said, "the British want 50 ships this year. I intend to give them double." A stunned silence settled over the room. Double. 100 ships in a year was madness. The British, after all, had suggested a mere 60 hulls in the entire program. But Land knew something the Japanese shipwrights in Nagasaki did not. America's industrial engine, once awakened, was a creature without precedent in human history. All it needed was a spark. Across the city, another meeting was taking place, this one far more technical. At a long oak table in the Bureau of Ships, engineers debated welding versus riveting. Riveting was tradition, proven, safe. Welding was fast, cheap, and terrifyingly new. A riveted hull had character. It creaked, flexed, and announced its strength. A welded hull stayed silent, but if a seam failed, it failed catastrophically. One older engineer slammed his palm on the table. "Welding will tear these ships apart in heavy weather." A younger engineer countered, "Riveting takes too long. We cannot beat U-boats with hammers, we beat them with speed. After hours of argument, the decision came down to arithmetic, not aesthetics. A riveted ship required thousands of skilled hands, a welded ship required hundreds of unskilled ones. America had the hundreds, it did not have the thousands. The verdict: weld the damn things. And with that choice quiet, bureaucratic, buried in technical memos, the United States committed itself to a revolution more profound than any single weapon. It embraced the idea that mass production, not craftsmanship, would decide the ocean's fate. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, another figure was about to redefine the possible: Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser was not a naval architect. He was not even a shipbuilder. He had built dams, highways, and hospitals. But he understood one thing better than any engineer in Washington: speed was a weapon. Standing on the mudflats of Richmond, California, Kaiser surveyed a windswept patch of shoreline where, in his mind, a shipyard larger than any in history already existed. He jabbed a finger toward the empty land. "We will build ships here, hundreds." The Navy liaison laughed. "Mr. Kaiser, you don't even have dry docks." "I do not need them. I will pour them." "You don't have welders. I will train them." "You don't even have shipwrights." "I'll teach them." 2. Before the year ended, Kaiser's barren shoreline held rows of prefabrication sheds, acres of assembly lines, a welding school staffed with masters, cafeterias serving 24-hour shifts, and workers pouring into Richmond from every state in the Union. Housewives became welders. College students became crane operators. Grandfathers became plate burners. Women with no industrial experience learned to lay perfect seams after 2 weeks of training, and the ugly cargo ship Washington had approved became the perfect vessel for Kaiser's super yard. Rectangular holds? Easy to fabricate. Flat plates? Easy to cut. Simple engine room? Easy to install. Welded seams? Ideal for assembly lines. What Mitsubishi craftsmen took months to shape in Nagasaki, Kaiser workers would churn out in days. Japan built ships as artisans. America planned to build them as appliances. Early in 1942, as Roosevelt toured the first Liberty ship launched from Bethlehem Fairfield in Baltimore, he asked a simple question: "How many more can we build?" The shipyard manager replied, "Sir, at full capacity, 1 ship every 10 days. Roosevelt smiled faintly. "We must do better than that." He did not mean 10% better. He meant orders of magnitude better. Within months, shipyards from New Orleans to Portland began receiving standardized templates. Prefabricators in Pittsburgh and Detroit received contracts to cut steel plates shaped to tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. Railroads began delivering modular sections, bow units, stern units, prefabricated decks ready to weld. It was not shipbuilding, it was assembly. And assembly could be scaled. On the eve of war, Japan had believed its fleet of merchantmen, painstakingly crafted, beautifully riveted, represented a strength America could never match. But Japan was measuring ships. America was measuring process. The ugly Liberty ship was not a vessel. It was a hack, a loophole in the mathematics of war, a weapon disguised as mediocrity. And before long, Japan would learn what Washington already suspected. In a global war, beauty meant nothing. Only multiplication mattered. The first Liberty ship assembled at Henry Kaiser's new Richmond yard did not glide into the water with the elegance of Mitsubishi's masterpieces. She rattled, she groaned. Her bow slapped the waves like a steel hammer. Reporters smirked. Traditional naval architects whispered insults behind gloved hands. But the stopwatch told a different story. She had been assembled in 58 days, a number so outrageous that Washington at first suspected an accounting error. Japan's newest merchant hull, launched in Nagasaki that same winter, had taken close to a full year from keel to commissioning. The two ships were not simply separated by the Pacific Ocean, they were separated by centuries of industrial philosophy. And Kaiser was just getting started. By spring of 1942, Richmond Yard No. 1 resembled an industrial organism more than a shipyard. Welding arcs flickered like fireflies across the night. Locomotives delivered steel plate in endless streams. Prefabrication sheds churned out entire midship sections, each labelled with chalk marks and serial numbers, like giant pieces of a mechanical puzzle. Reporters touring the yard struggled to describe it. "It is not a shipyard," one wrote. "It is a ship factory." Kaiser's engineers treated hulls not as sacred naval objects but as assemblies of interchangeable units. A stern section welded on Monday would be identical to one welded on Friday. Any welder could work any seam, any crane could lift any subassembly. Standardization, painfully resisted by the old shipbuilding world, became the core of the Liberty Ship miracle. And Kaiser demanded more. He walked the yard at dawn, shouting for new welders to be hired, new cranes to be bought, new sheds to be erected. When a foreman told him the yard lacked enough skilled fitters, Kaiser opened a training school. When that school filled up, he opened 2 more. When the welders complained they were working through exhaustion, he built clinics, cafeterias, and daycare facilities right on the waterfront. Most radical of all, he hired anyone who walked through the gate. Black workers from Louisiana, white farmers from Oklahoma, Mexican laborers from the valley orchards, women who had never touched a welding torch, former carpenters, ex-mechanics, short-order cooks, school teachers. Shipbuilding, once the domain of master craftsmen, became democratized overnight. At first, the welds were crude. Plates warped, seams cracked. One early Liberty ship even split in half near the waterline during sea trials, sending naval traditionalists into a frenzy. But Kaiser's response was not defensive. It was procedural. He called metallurgists, adjusted welding temperatures, rewrote training manuals, standardized joint patterns, and issued new protocols. Every failure became a lesson. Every lesson became a process. Every process became a template. Japan, meanwhile, could not adjust its centuries-old system so quickly. Its craftsmen were too specialized, its yards too proud, its supply chains too brittle. Even as Japanese admirals boasted about the quality of their new tankers and transports, American shipyards were learning how to disassemble and rebuild time itself. In July of 1942, Richmond launched another Liberty ship in 51 days, then 45 days, then 39. The newspapers tracked each record like a sporting event. Workers amused at first, then fiercely competitive, push each other harder every week. Every weld counted, every shift change mattered, every rivet eliminated and replaced with a weld shaved hours off the clock. The culture changed. Speed was no longer a goal, it was a creed. Washington took notice. Admiral Land, normally stoic, allowed himself a brief smile during a maritime commission briefing. "If Kaiser continues at this pace," he said, "Japan will drown in our cargo ships before the year is out." Another analyst, flipping through production reports, spoke more bluntly. "Their submarines cannot sink ships, we can build faster than they can reload torpedoes." Across the ocean, Japanese naval intelligence began compiling reports on Liberty ship production. The numbers looked fabricated. They must have been fabricated. No nation could build cargo ships in mere weeks. Yet by autumn of 1942, confirmation arrived from multiple sources. Liberty ships were rolling off American assembly lines faster than Japan could build aircraft. A Japanese naval officer interrogated after the war would later recall, "We thought it was impossible. A ship, to us, was a work of art. How could Americans treat it like a crate? But crates, unlike masterpieces, could be multiplied." In November of 1942, Kaiser attempted the unthinkable, launching a Liberty ship in under 2 weeks. Foremen doubted him. Welders laughed. Newspaper editors mocked the goal as fantasy. "A ship in 2 weeks? Ridiculous." Kaiser simply pointed at the blueprint. "Gentlemen," he said, "the ship is already built. We merely need to assemble her." He threw every lesson from the prior months into the effort. Expanded night shifts, conveyor line material movement, optimized welding teams, synchronized crane operations, and pre-labeled components delivered directly to the slipway. The result was the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Japan's best yards could not build a trawler in that time. The Peary's launch became international news. Crowds watched in disbelief as the squat, homely Liberty ship slid into the Pacific, flags snapping in the wind. Welders who had never seen the ocean wept. Kaiser shook hands until his fingers went numb. Roosevelt himself sent a telegram. Japan sent silence. Because in Tokyo, the truth was beginning to settle like ash. They were not fighting the United States Navy, they were fighting the United States itself. Its factories, its railroads, its welders, its shipyards, its mathematics. The Liberty ship was not elegant, but she was inevitable. And inevitability once launched never returned to shore. The first Liberty ships began appearing in Japanese naval intelligence summaries during the final days of 1942. At first, the reports were vague, new American cargo type, welded hulls, production expanding. But by early 1943, Japan's Naval General Staff understood something was wrong. Merchant shipping losses were rising, American cargo traffic was increasing, and the ships being sunk did not seem to diminish the flow of American material at all. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, studying a map of the Pacific with thin lips pressed tight, whispered what no officer in the room wished to hear: "We are chopping bamboo. It grows faster than we can cut." It was not merely that America had more shipyards. That could be understood. It was that these new American cargo ships appeared faster than any logistical model Japan possessed could explain. A convoy sunk in the Solomons reappeared off Brisbane within days. Ships destroyed off Guadalcanal were replaced before their wrecks cooled. Japan, accustomed to measuring its merchant fleet in generations, was confronting a nation measuring its fleet in weeks. In Tokyo's Ministry of Transport, senior engineers pored over grainy reconnaissance photos of Liberty ships. Their expressions ranged from confusion to outright disdain. "They are ugly," one muttered. "They are slow," another added. "They will break apart in typhoons." A third engineer, older and more cautious, lifted one photo an American convoy off Samoa. "There are too many." That was the first hint of fear. Japan's own merchant fleet, carefully built, meticulously riveted, individually tailored, had numbered barely over 6 million tons at the start of the war. Losses in the first year of conflict were catastrophic. Tankers, especially, were irreplaceable jewels. Each required complex machinery, specialty steel, and skilled welders Japan did not have in abundance. By 1943, Japan was losing far more ships than it could build. An economic death spiral disguised behind patriotic slogans. The route from Singapore to the home islands, a lifeline of oil, rubber, and tin, grew thinner by the month. Yet American steel, assembled in anonymous chunks, flowed across the Pacific like a second tide. Japan counted ships, America counted hours. While Japanese officials argued about hull shapes and welding quality, Admiral Land's Maritime Commission filed production numbers that stunned even the U.S. Navy. In the year 1942 alone, American shipyards delivered over 500 Liberty ships. Japan, in that same span, managed barely 1/10 of that number. The numbers worsened quickly. In 1943, over 1,000 Liberty ships. In 1944, more than twice that when Victory ships joined them. Japanese intelligence officers trained to analyze doctrine, strengths and weaknesses had no methodology for assessing industrial avalanche. Their reports increasingly contained phrases like unquantifiable, exceeds projection, and production appears limitless. One such report, recovered after the war from the Japanese 4th Air Group's administrative office in Truk, stated, "American merchant ship losses do not weaken their logistical output. We are unable to comprehend the mechanism." The mechanism was simple, but revolutionary. Liberty ships were built backwards, old shipyards built from bow to stern, Kaiser built from everywhere at once. While Japanese shipwrights shaped a keel with reverence, Kaiser's workers welded 20 sections simultaneously. While Japanese fitters hand-riveted a hull plate, American teenagers welded entire deckhouses in inland steel mills. While Japanese craftsmen argued about alignment, Kaiser's cranes dropped prefabricated blocks into place like oversized toys. Japan was running a marathon. America was running a conveyor belt. The shock reached the Japanese Navy in mid-1943 when a captured American officer revealed production statistics during interrogation. The interrogators assumed exaggeration. They accused the officer of lying. They shouted at him, insisted no country could build ships at that pace. Only after war's end did they confirm the truth. The officer had understated the numbers. The psychological blow this inflicted cannot be overstated. Japan had entered the war believing the United States decadent, soft, unable to sustain losses. But Liberty ships, ugly, slow, disposable, became the ultimate symbol of American contradiction. A nation assumed weak had discovered how to manufacture infinity. Japanese Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi later admitted during interrogation in 1946, "We thought your aircraft carriers were your greatest asset. We were wrong. Your cargo ships defeated us. A nation that replaces losses, without pause, cannot be beaten." By late 1943, Japan's ocean lifelines were collapsing. Tanker losses crippled fuel distribution. Coal shortages paralyzed railways. Army units in New Guinea starved. Aircraft remained grounded for lack of gasoline. Entire garrisons, cut off by submarine interdiction, dissolved into disease and hunger. Yet Liberty ships flowed into Australia, the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls. Food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, construction, steel, everything needed to feed an island-hopping superpower streamed across the Pacific in a ceaseless wave. Something unprecedented was happening in naval history. For every ship Japan lost, America built 20. This was not a metaphor, it was arithmetic. And arithmetic does not negotiate. Arithmetic does not retreat. Arithmetic does not run out of breath. Japan had launched a war believing the Pacific too vast, the distances too overwhelming for the United States to sustain operations. Liberty ship homely, lumbering, welded together by amateurs, rewrote the geography of war. It shrank the Pacific. It buried Japan's strategy under tonnage. It made time an American ally rather than a Japanese barrier. By the end of 1943, Japanese strategists no longer asked how to win. They asked how long they could delay inevitable defeat. And the answer, whispered inside dark conference rooms in Tokyo, became clearer with each passing month. As long as their shipyards allow. Those shipyards glowing like industrial volcanoes had already answered. They allowed forever. Early 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy convened an emergency logistics council in Tokyo. The meeting was supposed to last 1 hour. It stretched to nearly 10. Charts covered the wall's oil flow from the Dutch East Indies, tanker losses in the South China Sea, convoy timetables, submarine sinkings. The room was silent except for the rhythmic tap of abacuses and the whisper of sliding shoji doors. Rear Admiral Sadatoshi Tomioka, Chief of Planning, stared at a table crowded with casualty sheets. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are losing ships faster than we can build them." No one replied. The numbers were merciless. Japan needed at least 1 million tons of new shipping each year simply to maintain its empire's arteries. In 1942, it produced barely 200,000. In 1943, despite desperate measures, it might reach 300,000. Across the ocean, the United States was building more than 10 times that amount. Liberty ships, tankers, victory ships, at a rate Japan's mathematicians could not comprehend. The council adjourned without a solution. Because there was none. Meanwhile, on the west coast of the United States, the shipyards were entering a manic, almost delirious rhythm. At Oregon Shipbuilding, newly arrived welders were handed torches before their paperwork was dry. At Richmond, the night shift hummed with energy, floodlights turning the bay into a glowing furnace. At Bethlehem Fairfield in Baltimore, cranes swung prefabricated sections like they were handling children's toys. If a part did not fit, workers did not remake it, they remade the process. If a weld cracked, supervisors did not blame a welder, they rewrote the textbook. By spring of 1943, America launched so many Liberty ships that newspapers stopped printing the names individually. The list had grown too long, too fast. The launches blended together, one ship every week, then one every few days, then several in a single day. No navy in history had seen anything like it. One observer wrote, "It is as if the United States is pouring steel into the ocean and watching it sail away." Japan's response, however frantic, was trapped inside its own limitations. Shipyards introduced night shifts. They adopted welding reluctantly. They attempted prefabrication in tiny bursts. They simplified designs. They pressed artisans into exhaustion. But a system rooted in craftsmanship could not convert itself into an assembly line overnight. It lacked the machine tools, the mass steel production, the rail infrastructure, the standardized components. Japan could not build a Liberty ship even if it had the blueprint, and so Tokyo turned to stopgaps, wooden-hulled vessels, simplified cargo ships, emergency transports. Some were constructed with planks instead of steel plates. Others used low-grade metal that buckled easily. One Japanese naval officer wrote bitterly in his notebook, "We are building ships for the last century. They are building ships for the next one." In June of 1943, American submarines sank 10 Japanese merchant vessels in a single week. One was the Hakusan Maru, a tanker carrying precious aviation fuel. Another, the Kogiku Maru, sank with hundreds of soldiers bound for New Guinea. Each loss tore another thread from Japan's logistical fabric. And every time a Japanese ship went down, 2 Liberty ships took its place on the world's oceans. By August, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa reported that fuel shortages were so severe that carrier aircraft could not conduct meaningful training. Pilots practiced takeoffs without landings. Squadrons rationed flying hours like gold. Destroyers sat idle at anchor, their tanks nearly dry. The Empire had stunning warships, Yamato, Musashi, Shokaku, Zuikaku, but they were becoming floating monuments, beautiful yet useless, because a navy without fuel is not a navy, it is sculpture. Japan's hopes of reversing the trend hunting the Liberty ships themselves collapsed almost as quickly. Submarine captains complained that new American convoys were too large, too well escorted, and too frequent to disrupt. Aircraft crews reported that Liberty ships, slow as they were, always seemed to arrive in groups of 20 or 30, guarded by destroyers, aircraft, or both. American naval planners had turned quantity into its own form of armor. "You may sink one," Admiral Land famously said, "but there are 100 behind her. You cannot kill an idea by sinking a ship." Japan tried anyway. In September of 1943, a strike group from Truk attempted to intercept an American convoy near the Solomons. Weather obscured the convoy. Aircraft ran low on fuel and returned home. The U-boats Japan had purchased from Germany malfunctioned in tropical waters. The convoy passed unscathed. Weeks later, a captured Japanese radioman confessed under interrogation. "We began to believe the Liberty ships were invincible, not because of their steel, but because of your numbers." By autumn, the maritime situation had deteriorated into catastrophe. Entire garrisons in the Solomons and New Guinea were starving. Army units resorted to foraging, horses were eaten, ammunition became precious, medical supplies disappeared, sentries collapsed from malnutrition. The Imperial Army began calling its shattered divisions stranded islands. One Japanese general wrote in his diary, "We lost the war when we lost the sea, and we lost the sea when America began building ships as if they were bullets." Meanwhile, American bases from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane were jammed with Liberty ships, unloading cargo crates of shells, crates of rifles, crates of tinned meat, crates of aircraft parts, crates of gasoline drums. The docks looked like steel cities arriving on steel wheels. For the first time in naval history, a country was not merely supplying a war, it was oversupplying it. By the end of 1943, Japan's fleet of merchantmen had fallen to under 4 million tons. The empire, once stretched like a vast net across the Pacific, now resembled a fraying rope. And yet Liberty ships kept coming, one after another, ship after ship, month after month. A tide no hurricane could stop. Japan's admirals stared at those numbers and understood a truth that would never make it into public speeches. They could win battles. America could win the war. Because America had discovered the formula that made defeat impossible. Replace everything faster than the enemy can destroy it. The winter of 1943 settled over the Pacific like a curtain of grey rain, but in the shipyards of America the season barely registered. The cranes did not sleep. The welders did not slow. The rails that carried steel plate into the yards glowed red from continuous use. Kaiser's factories, Bethlehem's slipways, and the Atlantic coast yards thundered day and night. By then, Liberty ships were no longer an experiment. They were a rhythm. A Liberty ship launched on Monday in Oregon was matched by another on Tuesday in Texas. 2 more left the ways in New Jersey by Thursday. Another departed from Baltimore before the weekend. In December of that year, the United States Maritime Commission announced a figure that stunned even hardened admirals. America had effectively doubled the size of the merchant fleet in a single year. Japan could not replace even a fraction of what it lost. America could replace the entire war. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy convened a second emergency council just after New Year's Day, 1944. The atmosphere was bleak. Charts showed Japan's southern resource zone hemorrhaging. Convoys that once moved monthly now struggled to sail at all. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies, Japan's lifeblood, had fallen to less than 1/3 of required levels. Admiral Toyoda, gaunt after months of sleepless nights, placed a trembling hand on a stack of shipping reports. "Even victory at sea," he murmured, "cannot repair what our shipyards cannot build." Then he delivered a sentence that chilled the room. "We are no longer fighting the American Navy. We are fighting the American factory." Across the Pacific, American shipyards pushed themselves to new limits. Prefabrication workshops became so efficient that workers assembled entire deckhouses indoors, complete with wiring, plumbing, and ventilation, before lowering them onto hulls like blocks onto a child's toy. A shipyard foreman at Richmond joked, "If Henry Kaiser could figure out how to launch a ship sideways, we'd double our output again." Engineers laughed, but only for a moment because they knew he might try. At CalShip in Los Angeles, workers began finishing Liberty ships in assembly line fashion. Hull sections rolled down rails. Welders in synchronized teams moved like a choreographed troupe. Electricians followed with miles of cable, and painters sprayed entire bulkheads in minutes. The process transformed construction into something new, something no navy in the world had ever attempted. Industrialized war logistics. Japanese intelligence had no vocabulary for it. Their reports spoke of inexhaustible output, ship spawning, and one phrase, repeated so often it became a mantra: they build ships as if they were automobiles. That was the point. Meanwhile, American convoy tactics evolved to exploit the avalanche of new hulls. Convoys grew larger. Routes became redundant. Escorts multiplied. Destroyer escorts built almost as fast as Liberty ships swarmed around merchantmen in protective screens. Japan's submarines, already plagued by design flaws, now faced convoys too dense to penetrate and too well guarded to survive attacking. Any Japanese captain who tried soon found himself hunted by sonar-equipped escorts that outnumbered his entire wolf pack. 1 U.S. Our naval commander put it bluntly. If they sink one ship, it changes nothing. If we sink one of theirs, it changes everything. Japan's tonnage curve plunged like a falling stone. America's rose like a mountain. This was not strategy. This was not tactics. This was mass. A new kind of warfare, call it industrial supremacy, had begun. The clearest demonstration came during the build-up for the invasion of the Marshall Islands in early 1944. Over 100 Liberty ships gathered at Pearl Harbor, their hulls packed with ammunition, fuel, Seabees, cranes, trucks, tents, bulldozers, and prefabricated docks. Japan could not believe the sheer volume. Its officers expected a trick. Maybe half the landing force had been disguised as cargo. They were mistaken. Those were cargo ships, and there were more behind them. The Marshall Islands campaign proved decisive not because of battles, but because of construction. As soon as islands were seized, Liberty ships anchored offshore and disgorged the materials needed to transform coral atolls into forward air bases. Japan's soldiers fought with courage. America fought with steel. In April of 1944, the Imperial Navy's Shipping Bureau published a classified report assessing the crisis. The opening line was stark. "We have lost the ability to wage a maritime war." It was not prophetic, it was descriptive. The bureaucrats had accepted a truth, their admirals still resisted, admitting Japan's empire was collapsing at the docks, not the front. Its tankers were gone. Its cargo fleet was gutted. Its shipyards were crippled. Its reserves of steel, fuel, and manpower were dwindling. And Liberty ships, those inelegant, stub-nosed vessels mocked only a year before, were the engine of Japan's defeat. A former Japanese naval constructor later confessed in a 1962 symposium. "When we saw photographs of your assembly line shipyards, we realized the scale of our mistake. We believed craftsmanship would defeat crude mass production. But the war was not fought in the dry dock, it was fought in the factory. And we lost before we knew the battle had begun." Back in America, another Liberty ship slid into the water every few hours. Their names blurred: James Swan, Francis Key, Lily Auld, Charles Carroll. Some carried soldiers, some carried bombs, some carried locomotives. One carried an entire ready-made hospital. Every launch was a quiet triumph. Every hull was another nail in Japan's strategic coffin. By midsummer, American admirals stopped worrying about losses. They worried only about where to park the growing fleet. In a speech at the Pentagon, a logistics officer said something that captured the moment better than any headline. "We have reached the point where our shipbuilding is no longer supporting our strategy. Our strategy is supporting our shipbuilding." Japan had no answer, because Liberty ships were not just vessels. They were the proof that America had learned how to turn raw steel into time, motion, distance, and power, and Japan, sunk beneath the weight of that realization, could only watch the tide rise. By early autumn of 1944, the Pacific Ocean no longer belonged to the Imperial Navy. It belonged to the grey silhouettes crawling across the horizon: Liberty ships, Victory ships, fuel tankers, repair vessels, mobile dry docks, and troop transports moving in endless procession. Together, they formed not a fleet, but a moving continent. Japan's admirals studied reconnaissance photographs with growing despair. Where they once saw scattered task forces, they now saw maritime highways, thick with steel hulls. The chief of the Imperial Navy's operations section muttered, "How can we defeat a nation that manufactures oceans?" He was not exaggerating. The Pacific had become an American construction zone. One of the clearest signs came during the Philippines campaign. For Japan, regaining the islands was theoretically possible if they could reinforce them faster than the Americans. But theoretically possible collided with mathematically impossible. A Japanese convoy, leaving Formosa in late September, embarked with a handful of freighters and a pair of destroyers. Across the sea, American convoys looked like mobile cities, dozens of Libbies carrying tanks, artillery, aviation fuel, bulldozers, pontoon bridges, and entire engineering regiments. A single American convoy contained more cargo tonnage than Japan could deliver to the Philippines in an entire month. The difference stunned even hardened officers. In post-war interrogation, Rear Admiral Mikawa admitted, "We attempted to reinforce Leyte, but we had no ships left capable of reaching the islands. We sent men. We could not send their weapons. We could not send their food." Some Japanese reinforcement convoys arrived carrying starving soldiers. Others never arrived at all. American submarines hunted them relentlessly, sinking freighters Japan had no means to replace. An American captain explained the situation succinctly. A submarine torpedoed a Japanese ship, and the war moved forward. A submarine torpedoed one of ours, and a replacement left San Francisco before the wreck even sank. This difference replacement speed became the fulcrum on which the entire Pacific pivoted. Meanwhile, American engineers built bases the way Liberty ships were built: fast, standardized, and everywhere. On Leyte Gulf's beaches, bulldozers rolled off Liberty ships within minutes of landing. Road graders followed. Portable cranes came next. Fuel pumps, aviation matting, prefabricated Quonset huts. Everything came wrapped, crated, labeled, and ready. One CB officer joked, "We could build a city out of the cargo from a single Liberty ship," and sometimes we did. Japan watched in disbelief. A captain from the Japanese 4th Air Group later testified, "We bombed an airfield at dawn. When our reconnaissance plane returned at noon, the Americans had already repaired the runway and added a new one beside it." How? Because every time bombs fell, more Liberty ships arrived, carrying more steel, more men, more everything. To Japan's pilots, it seemed like America was regenerating entire islands overnight. Around this time, the Imperial Navy's Shipping Bureau produced a top-secret document entitled Analysis of Enemy Industrial Capabilities. Parts of it survived the war. One line, recovered by the Allied translator and interpreter section, became famous among historians. "The enemy constructs the means of war faster than we can destroy them. The attrition curve is inverted. In other words, Japan could no longer sink American ships faster than America built new ones. Japan could no longer destroy airfields faster than America repaired them. Japan could no longer knock out fuel depots, because American tankers delivered fuel in quantities Japan could not imagine. The empire was drowning under a tide of industrial arithmetic. In October of 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf sealed Japan's fate. Naval historians often focus on the carriers, battleships, and destroyers that clashed across the Philippine Sea. But behind the combat fleets loomed the true instrument of American victory, the logistics armada. During the battle, American carriers launched wave after wave of airstrikes. Why? Because they were refueled and rearmed continuously by Liberty ships, oilers, and ammunition ships. Japan's fleet, by contrast, had to run its remaining tankers dry simply to reach the battle area. A Japanese officer captured after the war described their desperation. "We sailed to Leyte, knowing we had fuel for only one battle. We had no oil to return to port." The Americans referred to this ongoing logistical miracle as the fleet train, a benign phrase that concealed its true nature. It was the world's largest floating supply chain, fueled by Liberty ships. Without them, Leyte Gulf would have been impossible. Without them, the Philippines could not be retaken. Without them, the Pacific would have remained an ocean of attrition instead of an American highway. One moment, one photograph captured Japan's realization better than any battle report. An Imperial Navy reconnaissance aircraft flying over Ulithi Atoll in November saw the lagoon filled with ships. Not a few dozen, not a few hundred, thousands. In the post-war symposium of 1962, a former Japanese aviator recalled, "I saw more ships in that lagoon than existed in the entire Japanese Navy. And the most shocking thing was this: many were cargo ships." The Americans were bringing the whole of their industry with them. He paused, then added, "At that moment, I understood the war was finished. Japan's collapse did not come from a single decisive blow. It came from thousands of steel hulls pushing westward, mile by mile, island by island, carrying the irresistible weight of American industry. The Liberty ship, a vessel Japan once dismissed as plain, crude, and unremarkable, had become the empire's executioner, not through firepower, not through speed, but through relentless presence. Japan lost the Pacific the day it realized America could build ships faster than Japan could sink them, could build bases faster than Japan could bomb them, and could build the future faster than Japan could defend the past. The war was no longer a contest of fleets. It was a contest of factories. And the factories had won. Tokyo's Naval General Staff building smelled faintly of ink, mildew, and despair in the winter of 1944. Inside a dim conference room, senior officers of the Imperial Navy assembled around a long lacquered table. They believed they were about to receive an update on American convoy movements. Instead, they would receive a funeral one measured in tonnage, not ceremonies. Rear Admiral Shigeaki Suzuki entered the room carrying a plain manila folder. No guards, no aides, no theatrics. Just a folder. He placed it on the table as if it weighed 100 pounds. "This," he said quietly, is the report we requested from the Ministry of Munitions. It concerns enemy ship construction versus our estimated wartime losses. The officers leaned forward. Suzuki cleared his throat. Gentlemen, this report explains why the Empire is dying faster than we can understand. The first pages showed a table comparing American merchant shipbuilding capacity to Japan's. The contrast was instantaneous and devastating. Japan's largest yards could produce roughly 3 cargo ships a month, assuming steel deliveries arrived on time, an assumption that had not been true since early 1943. By contrast, the United States was now producing 3 Liberty ships every day. One admiral blinked, assuming he'd misread the figures. Another frowned. That must be an exaggeration, someone muttered. No nation can build ships that quickly. Suzuki handed them the next sheet, sworn testimony from U.S. Maritime Commission inspectors captured at Wake Island. A calm engineering note explained, at peak capacity, Richmond Yard, number 2, is launching 1 Liberty ship every 24 hours. The room fell silent. Another page showed total Liberty ship production. A line graph climbed like a cliff face. By the end of 1943, the Americans had completed over 1,000 ships. By the end of 1944, the number would exceed 2,000. In Tokyo's war rooms, these statistics landed like explosives. Japan had nothing equivalent, not even close. An officer known for his stoicism covered his face with both hands. This is impossible. No country has that much steel. But that was the point. America did. The next section detailed American shipyard labor. Japan's shipbuilding workforce had steadily shrunk since 1942 due to conscription, starvation, and fuel shortages. Skilled riveters were gone. Welders worked 12-hour days on half rations. Meanwhile, American yards had mobilized an army of workers over 700,000 men and women. Photographs showed American women welding Liberty ship seams with sparks flying across clean factory floors. Another photo showed a yard cafeteria with fresh vegetables. Japan's officers stared at the images. "Look," whispered one admiral, "they are eating meat." To men surviving on rice balls and declining morale, the sight was almost offensive. The next folder section was the most shocking: ship replacement rate versus loss rate. Suzuki read aloud, "For every Japanese merchant ship sunk, the United States replaces approximately 10 Liberty ships." He flipped the page. American shipyards had replaced all merchant losses in the Pacific in less than 6 months. Japan, by contrast, had reached a point where more tonnage was being lost each week than the entire empire could build in a year. One officer spoke with trembling voice. "This means, even if we sank everything at Leyte, they would replace it before the next battle." "Yes," Suzuki said. "Exactly. But a moment of collapse came with the section labeled Logistical Implications for the Pacific War. Inside were aerial photographs of Saipan, Guam, Eniwetok, and Ulithi Atoll, not of airfields, not of fortifications, but of harbors filled beyond imagination. Liberty ships anchored in dense clusters, rows of oilers, lines of ammunition ships, floating dry docks big enough to lift destroyers clean out of the sea. To the Japanese officers, the images looked artificial, like propaganda paintings. "These are real?" someone asked. "Yes," Suzuki replied. "All taken by our reconnaissance units." The officers leaned closer. American ships were so numerous they cast interlocking shadows across the water. One admiral whispered, "Ulithi alone contains more ships than we have left in the entire combined fleet." That was no exaggeration. Another document revealed the staggering scale of American cargo movement. In 1 month alone, August of 1944, the U.S. Navy delivered more aviation fuel than Japan could refine in a year, more ammunition than Japan could produce in 6 months, more food than the Japanese army could hope to deliver to New Guinea for the remainder of the war, and all of it crossed the Pacific inside Liberty ships. A memo from the operations section added, "The enemy's logistics now possess momentum independent of tactical outcomes. Even if we win battles, the overall trend remains unchanged." It was the first official recognition that the war had become unwinnable. The final document was the killing blow. It was a projection simple, brutal, undeniable. If Japan sank every American ship afloat in the Pacific, the United States could replace the entire fleet in less than 1 year. Japan could not replace even a tenth of its losses in the same period. One admiral stood up so suddenly his chair fell backward. He pounded the table. Then what are we fighting for? If the sea itself belongs to them, the islands will fall one by one. Our soldiers starve while their ships arrive full. He wasn't wrong. Rear Admiral Suzuki closed the folder. His voice was steady but hollow. Gentlemen, the war will not be lost when our battleships sink, nor when our cities burn. It is already lost. It was lost the day the first Liberty ship slid into the water. The officers stared in silence. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Tokyo understood the truth. America was not merely building ships. America was building inevitability. The Liberty ship was more than a cargo vessel. It was an arithmetic weapon, an industrial verdict, proof that Japan had entered a war it could never win.